Escape to Freedom by Ruth Fosdick Jones. Chapter 11. Don't let them take me. The night seemed more and more quiet the farther they went, and colder. Above them, the stars shone icy and bright, and under the iron-bound wheels of the wagon, the dirt road was crusted with frost. They passed Ferry Street and followed on out Niagara. The houses were far apart and lonesome-looking here, but gradually they became more numerous as the fishing party approached Black Rock. Here, where Skagwakwata Creek emptied into the basin behind the shelter of Unity Island, a settlement had grown up, a village just that year annexed by Buffalo, but still known by force of habit as Black Rock. Here, too, the Erie Canal emptied into the little harbor, the protected water behind the low dunes of Unity and Bird Islands, serving as its channel until it cut into the land again and made its final way to Buffalo. There was always traffic in the harbor, those from the canal and from the river traffic that used the harbor, because it was the shortest run from the Canadian shore. This, of course, was why John Blaine kept his rowboat there. He, too, needed a short route to Canada. The wagon rattled over the plank bridge spanning the creek, and a quarter of a mile farther on, turned off Niagara Street into a rutted track that led down toward the shore. They left Nellie well blanketed in the shelter of a small stand of trees, and, gathering up their rods and bait bucket, made their way to the harbor. "I'm not sure," said John Blaine as they walked along, "that we picked a good night for fishing. It is going to be very cold on the river." They reached the boat drawn up on the shore, stored their fishing gear, and pushed the heavy craft into the water. "You boys take the first thwart," directed John Blaine, motioning Timothy and Jake to the seat nearest the bow, "and I'll take the other. Mr. Dunning," he added to Sam, "will you please take the stern seat?" They got on the boat as he directed and pushed off. "Now," he said, "we'll head right down the middle of the channel until we are abreast of the lower end of Unity Island. Then we'll turn across the river." They picked up the heavy oars and started on their way over the inky water, unnoticeable unless one was listening for the creaks of oarlocks and the subdued splash of oars. Apparently someone was. They had not been rowing long before Timothy, idly scanning the darkness, noticed a deeper blur upon the black water that seemed to move after them as they moved. He twisted in his seat and glanced ahead. They had almost half a mile to go before they reached the tip of the island and could turn westward across the river. He turned back. Over his father's shoulder, he could see that blot upon the darkness. It seemed to be no nearer, but it was there. His father spoke before he could. "Watch your stroke, Tim. I'll set the course." Timothy ignored what his father had said. "Father, I think there's a boat back there, and I think it is following us." "Are you sure, Tim?" whispered Jake. Sam groaned softly. The rhythm of John Blaine's stroke remained unbroken, but Timothy felt him stiffen as he peered astern. "You're right, Tim. There is a boat, but it may not be following us. We'll continue as we are for a few minutes until we find out." They went on dipping their oars in and out of the quiet water. But now Timothy's heart was pounding in his chest, and he was sure that Jake's was too. They all watched that ominous blur on the water behind them. "I think," said John Blaine after a minute or two, "that they may be looking for us. Undoubtedly, they can hear the sound of our oars, but I doubt if they have seen us as yet. We are under the lee of the island here, where it could be hard to see us against the land. Also, sound is apt to echo in this harbor, and I doubt if they know exactly where we are. Don't break the rhythm of your stroke. He sounded so calm that the boys began to relax and even dared to take the time to steal a glance over their shoulders toward the dimly seen end of Unity Island. Timothy noted that it had come appreciably nearer. "We have two alternatives," Timothy's father went on. "We can head for the shore and let you out, Sam. You would have no trouble hiding in the darkness, but I don't know when we'd have a chance to get you back in the boat. And if daylight came before we were able to rescue you, you would be in a rather trying position." "Reckon I'll stay right here, Mr. Blaine," said Sam steadily. "I've started on my way. I don't want to go back." "Good. Well, then," said Mr. Blaine with the air of one who has cleared away the preliminaries, "we'll just edge over a little more toward the island as we go along to take advantage of the darkness as long as possible." A muffled shout interrupted him. "They've seen us," whispered Jake. "Yes," replied John Blaine. "Somebody in that boat must have good eyes." "My master," said Sam in a frightened voice. "He can see in the dark like a cat." "Pull on your starboard oar," John Blaine ordered shortly. This was Timothy's oar. He heaved on it, and the heavy boat turned its nose closer in toward Unity Island. "Not too much," cautioned John Blaine. "I'm just trying to cut the corner as closely as possible." Timothy could see what his father's strategy was. By edging in toward the shore, they cut to the minimum the distance they had to row to round the end of the island. They bent to their oars and wasted no more breath in talk. There was no longer any doubt that they were seen, for the other boat was directly astern of theirs. But, steadied by John Blaine's calm acceptance of their situation, the two boys settled down to a steady stroke that, yard by yard, carried them over the still water of the harbor toward the lower end of Unity Island. So far, they had kept their lead, but neither Timothy nor Jake dared to risk a glance over their shoulder for fear of breaking a stroke and slowing the boat. John Blaine rowed easily, apparently as unconcerned as though he had no more on his mind than getting to the fishing ground in the shortest possible time. But Timothy could see him turn his head every once in a while, now towards Black Rock, now towards the shore of the island, and guessed that he was calculating to a split second when it would be safe to swing around the point out into the river. That they were close to the end of the island, Timothy knew, but he was startled nonetheless when his father commanded suddenly, "Tim, pull on your oar, hard." Obediently, Timothy yanked the starboard oar. There followed a confused moment during which he was aware of the black mass of the end of the island sliding past no more than 20 feet away. He had just time to think how well his father knew these waters to pilot them so well in the inky darkness when a shout went up in the boat that was following them. He heard someone cry, "It's them, all right. They're going straight across the river." For a moment, Timothy saw the western shore of Unity Island as a more solid blackness in the night. Then his father said, "All right, Jake, Tim, come on, both of you, row." Then they were in the turbulent, rolling current, the waves slapping against the sides of the boat and spraying them with icy water. Obediently, the boys braced their feet against the deck cleat and pulled hard on their oars. In front of him, Timothy could see his father's shoulders moving under the strength of his stroke, and beyond him, Sam, clutching the gunwale on either side. Behind them, rocking like a cockle shell in the current, came their pursuers. The other boat was no longer just a blot on the water. It was nearer now. John Blaine realized that the boat was gaining on them. "Boys," he said briefly, "pull harder. We'll try to keep her headed as straight across as we can. It's harder that way, but it's shorter." "Yes, father," panted Timothy. He and Jake looked at each other and pulled harder at their oars. Time reduced itself to a straining wrench upon the heavy oar, an effort to lift it above the splashing waves and dip it in again. Timothy's mouth was dry with fear, and Jake was half sobbing from fright and his exertions. John Blaine was silent, but his shoulders heaved as he bent every ounce of his strength to his task. Then, for a little while, they held their own so that the two boats were rolled and splashed on their way as though they had a tow line between them. But it could not last. The contest was too unequal. There were 3 grown men rowing the other boat, the marshal, probably, and 2 deputies. There was also a figure in the stern seat that Timothy guessed was Colonel Morgan. That much he could see in the light of the foam and the starlight. Then his heart sank like a stone to the bottom of a pool. The reason he could see in so much detail, he realized, was that their pursuers were now only a few boat lengths behind them. They would never make it to the other shore, he thought despairingly. From the stern, he could hear Sam's broken praying, and beside him, Jake cried, "They're going to catch us, sure." John Blaine said nothing. He still pulled with all his strength at his oars, and by his example, encouraged the boys to keep on with their own punishing task. Timothy was fully aware of his spent breath and the terrible ache in his arms, especially the one so recently broken. But the whole foreground of his mind was centered on the boat, so inevitably overtaking them. This time, he thought, not even his father would be able to find a way out for them. As if he sensed what his son was thinking, Mr. Blaine, for the first time since they had left the shelter of Unity Island, turned his head and glanced over his shoulder toward the Canadian shore. After a keen inspection of the darkness ahead, he moderated his stroke and said quietly, "All right, boys, you can stop rowing now." Timothy was so astonished that he forgot his fear. His father couldn't be giving up. Perhaps they couldn't make it, but they could keep on trying. Surely his father wouldn't give up before he had to. Not his father. "No, father, no!" he heard himself shouting. "No!" And from the stern came Sam's voice, high with terror, crying, "You're not going to let them take me, sir. Oh, don't let them take me." "Of course not, Sam. Trust me." Timothy's father spoke up with such authority that they all fell silent. Unperturbed, he plied his oars just enough to hold his course in the swift current, waiting for the marshal's boat to come close enough to hail them. "Do you have a slave in that boat?" shouted one of the rowers, and Timothy thought he recognized the marshal's voice. John Blaine did not hesitate. "Yes," he shouted back. The figure in the stern spoke then. "Is his name Sam Morgan?" he asked in the familiar southern accent that left no doubt as to his identity. "Yes," replied John Blaine shortly. "Then hand him over." The rowers in the other boat pulled on their oars, preparatory to closing in on their quarry. To the 2 boys clinging to their oars and seeing in their imagination the gates of prison closing upon them, and to Sam, cowering in despair on the stern seat, John Blaine's reply came with the shock of a sudden dip in the river. "I am sorry to disappoint you, gentlemen," he shouted, "but we are in Canadian waters now," his voice rose triumphantly, "and you can't take him." Jake and Timothy gasped, half seen, at each other in the darkness. Of course! Why hadn't they thought of it themselves? Everybody knew that the international boundary line between the United States and Canada ran down the middle of the Niagara River. Trust his father, Timothy thought proudly, to turn that knowledge to his own advantage and save them all. They watched the marshal's boat fall farther and farther astern until it was lost in the darkness. For a moment or two, Timothy thought he could hear the blustering of Colonel Morgan's disappointment, but he didn't care. Sam was safe. They were all safe. He shivered suddenly. He had forgotten how cold it was. His jacket sleeves and his trouser legs were soaked with spray, and his fingers, now that he had stopped rowing, were stiff with cold. His father's voice cut across his discomfort. Well, let's be on our way, he said. A little rowing will warm us up. Except you, Sam. Are you very cold? He inquired solicitously. I don't think I've ever been any colder, answered the man, his teeth chattering, but I've never been happier either. John Blaine chuckled, satisfied, and bent to his oars once more. Timothy's blade splashed water over him as he ran it out, and he suppressed a groan when his aching muscles protested. But this easy downstream diagonal course seemed like child's play after bucking the current, as they had done before. I'm sorry I had to make you work so hard, boys, apologized John Blaine after a few moments, but I didn't dare go too far downstream. It is easy to miscalculate the distance in the dark, and I wanted to make sure that I was more than halfway across if our pursuers caught up with us. I've rowed over here so often now that I can almost tell by the amount of ache in my arms how close I am to Canada. Do your arms ache too, Mr. Blaine? Asked Jake. Bless you, yes, answered John Blaine. We are almost out of the current now, so if you two have warmed up, you may ship your oars. I can take her in. Gratefully, the boys obeyed and sat silently while Mr. Blaine guided the boat out of the current and into the mouth of a little creek. He nosed under the branches of an overhanging willow, and the bow touched the shore. While he tied the boat to a tree branch, the boys helped Sam out onto the grassy bank of the shore of Canada. The big man fell to his knees and solemnly kissed the ground. Glory be to God, and thanks to you and the boys, Mr. Blaine. I'm free, he cried, and as he rose to his feet, Timothy saw, in the starlight, tears glistening on the former slave's face. His father's hand descended on Sam's shoulder and gripped it hard. Don't thank us, Sam. We should feel repaid 1,000-fold when you get Georgie back. We shall be waiting for that day. I hope it will not be far off. He sighed. And now I am afraid that it is time for us to go. Come with me, and I'll set you on your way. They climbed the bank to the level field that stretched before them in the darkness. Beyond it, over to the left, where a stand of trees showed against the light, a light showed against the sky, a light shone dimly. John Blaine pointed it out. Head for that light, he said briefly. They are expecting you. Goodbye, and may God bless you, Sam Morgan. Goodbye, Sam. Goodbye, echoed the two boys as the big man shook hands quickly all around. Then he was gone, made invisible by the night. For a moment or two, they could hear the silent crunch of his footsteps on the frozen grass, then nothing but the everlasting rush of the river waters. Well, boys, John Blaine worked his shoulders under the heavy coat to ease them. We had better be getting on our evening's program. Why? Exclaimed Timothy in surprise. What are we going to do now? His father chuckled. We are going fishing, of course, he answered. That is what we came for, isn't it?